Greetings, everybody. Welcome back again. Today we're doing something a little different at the Academy. We're going to look at a manual, a classic that is recorded in the Wu Bei Zhi. The Wu Bei Zhi, some of you may know, is a Ming military encyclopedia. It's a very comprehensive work. It has over 10,000 pages to it. 240 volumes in 5 major sections. So it's really a gigantic work. I would translate Wu Bei Zhi as something like Military Preparedness Annual. A real literal translation that we sometimes see used on the different sources is Armaments, Technology, or Records of Armaments and Military Provisions. So it's an enormous book. I have a facsimile of it, and it's about this thick, and it covers everything. It has these 5 sections I mentioned. It has how to build the walls for the Great Wall, how to do different fortifications, ships, siege equipment, weaponry. It even has information on the weather and tactics and geography. So it is meant to be like the military encyclopedia. The copy that we have that exists today dates from the Ming Dynasty, but it goes all the way back to the Eastern Zhou Dynasty. So it's a work that's been added to and added to and added to over time. That's why it's 10,000 plus pages. We're going to look at a work that's is part of this, that is for the Shuangshou Jian, the two-handed Jian. And before we do that, I want to look at some Shuangshou Jian from the period, or actually probably from later period. I doubt these are Ming, probably Qing period, but they are similar to, or really very, very similar to the ones used during the Ming when we see what we see in illustrations and that. So I want to take a look first at the actual weapons so we have that context and understand what we're looking at. The first one here is really a massive piece. Probably dates from the Taiping Rebellion. As you can see, it's really, I got to get back so you can see it, really quite a sword. The blade itself, put that down so I don't crack anything. The blade itself is 46 3/4 inches long, so it's really massive. It's 118.5 centimeters. So you can see it's really something else. Overall, it's 65 1/4 inches, so it's really, again, obviously a really long piece. 156 centimeters. The grip itself, that's 16 inches or 40.5 centimeters. So really, you can see obviously with a blade of this kind of length, you really need that long grip, not only to be able to handle it, but of course to help counterbalance it. Just like this, really, really heavy ones to sink down. It weighs almost 6 pounds. So it's really, now this is a monster of a sword that's 2.75 or 2 3/4 kilos. So this is about as big as they get, I think. It still is, if you can sort of see here, boom, I give it a little tap on the fittings are a bit loose, but if I tap it, you can see how the blade has a nice spring to it. So it's really, really fine steel. It's a typical Sanmei construction, 3-plate construction that Chinese swords are. Probably won't be able to see it on screen here. Again, we get a little bit closer. You can see here that sort of frosty edge where that hardened edge is. When we're looking at any period sword, it's really useful to sight down the blade and see, was this one that was used, and what kind of action has it seen? So if I sight down the blade like this, look at those edges, I can see quite clearly that this sword saw action. It was used in combat. It has an inscription that makes me think it's from the Taiping Rebellion, perhaps carried by the rebels. I think just holding it for a brief period like this, at 6 pounds, boy, I have to say, whoever wielded this must have been really big fellow, really quite strong, and have had a lot of training not to have, when you're delivering a G cut, a powerful cut, not to have that pull you off balance. You probably have to be a big guy himself, but also to have trained a lot to be able to control a blade like this. It's really something. But going back to looking at the blade itself and really sighting down that and having a look at it, one thing is quite clear is that there is very little edge damage. There is just, what we would expect. There's some incidental here and there. I can see there was a ding there, for example. But overall, it's really, having been through in the wars, in the Taiping rebellions, which were terrible warfare, it has not seen really anything more than incidental edge damage. This is going to be important as we look at the manual and continue this discussion, looking at that classic, to understand how swords were used. It's very useful. It really helped me to understand things and clear up the misconceptions that I had in the past, how these weapons were used. There is no evidence on this or on any other weapon Chinese weapon that I've handled of the sort of regular, concentrated damage that we'd see to the edge if edge pairing was used regularly and constantly. You see that on European swords. You don't find that on Chinese swords. So that's really important to our discussion to understand how these blades are used. We can look at it and go, okay, where's the damage? And that tells us how this, what kind of action this saw and how it saw it in regular use. What did it have to deal with? So anyway, so that's a real monster of a one. And I would say this is not a typical example. There are obviously examples like this. I've seen one other one, same dimensions, really almost kind of the cousin of this one. That one had a different guard. This has, of course, the saber style of guard. That one had a more typically standard Jian kind of guard. But this is not your common Shuangshou Jian. This is one that was for an exceptional individual, both in stature and skill. So let me set that down for a moment, get it out of the way. Really rare piece, that one. Here we have another example. This one, I think, is much more typical of what we would see during the late Ming, when the manual we're going to discuss comes from, but also into the Qing. I don't know the period this dates from. I'd have to see the Tang to do that, but it's more reasonable to assume that it's Qing rather than Ming. Although, when we think about these two-handed weapons, they generally date from that what was sometimes called the Ming-Qing cataclysm, the conquest period of the Qing dynasty of the Manchus taking China. And the reason probably is, no one wrote these things down in the past, but in the late Ming dynasty through the early Qing dynasty with the loyalist forces, the Ming forces, many people started using two-handed weapons, not just Jian, also Dao, also iron rods, Jian. So, they grew in popularity during that period. And you gotta think, well, why was that? I think it's likely because if you're infantryman and you have a largely cavalry force attacking you, you want to be able to reach a little bit higher if you can. So a little bit longer blade is useful. Also, when you've got a man on a horse bearing down on you with whatever kind of weapon he's wielding, you want to be able to have something solid to protect yourself. So that's kind of why I think this was why they saw a surge in interest. There's nobody wrote it down, so we can't say exactly why. We don't have a period source that tells us that, but that seems reasonable to me. This one, of course, you can see obviously is much shorter than the first example we looked at. This has a blade of 32¼ inches long. So a little bit longer than your standard single-handed Jian, but just about 1 inch, 2 inches longer than we commonly find for a single-handed Jian. But holding it like this, it really feels heavy. It doesn't feel like a single-hander. That's 82 centimeters. The overall length is, 42 inches or 107 centimeters. So that is, again, just not that much longer than a single-handed Jian. The grip is just 7 3/4, 19½ centimeters. And maybe most importantly, in comparison to the other, this is less than half the weight. It's 2 pounds, 12 ounces or 1.26 kilos. So considerably less. I can wield it if I get up on my feet here. I can wield this with one hand, but I would lose control. If I were really using this in any kind of combat, a liao I can do pretty well. The weight swings right through. But something like, say, a picador it'd be impossible to control this with one hand for any length of time unless you're doing your movements really, really slowly. But also what's interesting, as soon as you take the sword into hands, even though the script doesn't seem very particularly long for a blade of this length and weight, it immediately feels really good. There I start to feel like, okay, yeah, now I can give these, G cuts and, various and intercept and move with it quite nicely. So interesting that as soon as you take it with two hands, it balances quite nicely. And this particular one, I would say, is very close to, if you look at the pictures in the Wu Bei Zhi from the manual there, that this one looks about the same proportions as what we see in that manual. Of course, those are old woodcuts, doesn't give us dimensions, but we can sort of see the size of the man and the length of the blade. And I'd say this one is pretty close to what we see in that manual. So let's jump ahead and take a look now at that actual manual. I didn't memorize it, so I'm going to read it for you. This is the Shuangshou Jian Tupu, which is the two-handed sword illustrated manual. Shuang means a pair. Typically, we would translate that as two-handed, but you could say a paired hands weapon. And here's the classic itself. First, study eye method, striking methods, washing method, and the thrusting method. Striking method has 5 types: the leopard head strike, the left crossover step strike, right crossover step strike, left flank strike, right flank strike. Thrusting method has 5 types: against the scales thrust, and here I'll just interject, the term is ni lin, which is translated against the scales, and that means something, go counter to the direction of the scales. And of course, you'll think about armor of the period. Remember, this manual goes back quite some time. You had scale armor, which looks like fish scales kind of, and lamellar armor. And you sometimes want to be able to thrust up underneath those, or I would say get into the chinks of the armor, places where the armor can't completely cover, and you can slip into those. So when it says against the scales, I'm taking that to mean we're slipping into those chinks in the armor, trying to take advantage of the way the plates are lined up. So we have the level stomach thrust, the double bright thrust, the left wedged between, that's when you're pressing from either side, the thrust, and the right wedged between thrust. The blocking method has 3 types: raising the cauldron, we're going to look at that one, the whirlwind block, and resist the chariot block. The washing method has 3 types: the phoenix head wash, tiger's cave wash, soaring dragon wash. Okay? So that's the entirety of the classic. If you want to know more of this, we're not going to go into all of them, all of the different types. You can look at those on your own. The text is quite terse and obviously open to a lot of interpretation. If you really want to get the whole text and dig into yourself, you can find my book, Ming Military Chinese Swordsmanship, on Amazon. Translated the entire text there, all the different 24 postures, as well as many other Ming Dynasty sword texts. So if you want to get into that, check that source. You want to get down to the details of individual postures. What I want to do today, though, is talk about, let me move this a little bit, how this manual is useful to us today. How can we use this? How can we make use in our practice? So the first thing is that the manual gives us, make myself a little room here, 4 categories of cuts. It gives us the ji, striking, ci, thrusting, ge, the blocking cut, and xi, watching, which is a neutralization. These 4 types of cuts are really, it can be into sort of 2 categories or 2 types. Cuts that are passive, or techniques that are passive, and ones that are active. The ji, hitting, and the ci, thrusting, are active. That means that I'm in a superior position. So in other words, I've deflected, or I have an opportunity to hit first, and I do. So I'm in the tactically superior position. That's the active position. Passive position means, okay, the Duifang's already into a cut. My Duifang, my enemy, has a tactically stronger position, and if I try to just come in and cut or thrust or do something, Duifang's blow is going to land first, and I'll be done. So I have to first neutralize And that's either going to be with a deflection, a xi neutralization, or a ge blocking kind of cut. We also have to remember, when we look at these things, the context. Here I have this nice helmet, probably dates from the Ming Dynasty, may go back as far as Yuan Dynasty. The type is very similar. If you hit a helmet like this and it's on your enemy, your sword will bounce off of that. So even if you come in and hit very solidly, that's the whole reason you have helmets. The reason that you use them is that they protect them. So you may take them off balance for a moment, but when your enemy is in armor, you have to fight very differently. Also, you're on the battlefield, you have multiple opponents and a variety of weapons. So this is not like dueling with a single hand Jane. You can say, okay, I deflect here and I carve my way in this way. You can't really do that here. You have to be very forceful and very quick, because if I don't deal with this enemy very quickly, then his comrades may get me. We have to really keep moving forward. So this is very specifically a battlefield weapon. We can't think of this in terms of typical sort of Gen 5 that we think of today, which is much more of a dueling kind of weapon. The classic also gives us an order of things. So classics give us this order of use, of efficiency, you might say, or effectiveness. The first is the G cut. Now, if you're thinking of this as a manual for training soldiers, and for example, you see this kind of position like this in the manual, what am I doing? I'm going to step in and hit. If you're a swordsman on the battlefield, the first thing you got to be able to do is G strike. We should know that this G term means to strike or to hit. Later on, during the Qing period, G generally means a shorter, quick energy cut, not as powerful a cut. During this earlier period, during the Ming Dynasty, we see G used in manuals to mean striking as a powerful kind of strike. So it's a general word that means to hit or strike. And in this context, we really have to take it to mean a more powerful striking. And we can see, in the manual, when we see, positions like this illustrated, obviously this is not a quick little cut, intercepting cut, but a very powerful cut. And that's the first thing any soldier, anybody on the battlefield is going to want to learn how to do is, how can I hit this guy, my enemy, quickly, solidly, and prevent him from hitting me? So we have to think of these cuts in those kinds of terms. I tend to think of this not simply as, okay, I'm hitting and bashing him, which certainly I'm going to try to hit him and bash him as hard as I can, but as an active intercept. And what I mean is, if you're approaching me, if my enemy's really coming in, then I might try to, boom, I'm hitting that hand. If I strike to the arm, I can really do something. Remember, when men are in full armor, the reason they're in full armor is you can't hurt them. It's like shooting a tank with a rifle. It doesn't matter. It just bounces off. A man who is well armored, when you strike him, you're not doing very much. Hopefully, you're going to take him off balance. You might hit him just right, dislocate a bone, but you really can't count on that. However, if I hit somebody on the arm, it's less armored. The arm obviously is more susceptible to the damage. And if the Duifang were coming in to deliver a blow to try to take me out, and I can, bang, hit that arm, not looking to hit his weapon, sometimes I might, but if it's a sword or any kind of iron rod or something, bang, I want to hit that arm. Because you have to remember, again, the context here is I'm fighting with many other guys. My comrades are here, his comrades are there, and when I strike, boom, if I hit his arm, imagine he's coming down with a two-handed weapon here, and I strike that arm. If I strike the elbow, for example, even with the armor on, he's going to be badly hurt, incapacitated for some time, maybe not for long, but once I do incapacitate him, I can come again with my thrust, or also just as likely, one of my comrades next to me can take advantage of it being off balance. So the first thing is going to be to strike and hit your Duifang. And it's the easiest thing too. I mean, if you think about battlefield, what can you do quick and easy? You can hit somebody. So first thing is to Ji strike. Second, the manual gives us is shi, washing. So that makes sense because if you can hit, then you want to try to prevent being hit yourself. And so I'm going to shi, wash, and deflect this way. You can wash. Now, we should say this is a rather, you could say simplified, not in the sense that it's making it simplistic, but it's keeping it kind of clear and concise and straightforward. So the manual seems to suggest at times, and again, it's very, very terse. So you always have to have some interpretation in there, but it talks about things that looks like, okay, what we would call a maw today. I'm using the flat of my blade to press in. I can be deflecting. You see a lot of positions in the manual depicted like this. The other difficulty, of course, with interpreting a manual, any of these old manuals, but this one, of course, is that you get one image. You know, if you take out books today and time I would illustrate a technique, I may have 6, maybe even 8 individual photos showing the starting position to the finishing position. In these old manuals, you get one, and it's not clear sometimes what the description is, and the manual seems like, well, that looks like that's just before it or just after it. So you have to think about it and have some good sense of how swords were used so you can interpret, well, where in there is your Duifang. But if we see movements like this, these are very clearly illustrated manuals, and what we see is that the sword is always turned out with the flat being employed, not the edge. And we don't have anything, movements like this, in shi move kind of movements, it's always the flat. And again, this is something that I know today there are people who think, oh, they used edge parrying. And I would say, I'm sorry, having handled not only these period antique weapons, but thousands of period antique weapons, we simply see zero evidence of that. If these two long sabers, long jian, long two-handed jian, had been used regularly for edge parrying, when cuts were coming in at them, we would see a lot of damage accruing right there at the fore of the blade, and we don't see any. So clearly when there's no evidence to support something, it's simply not true. So second thing is shi, washing, and neutralizing. If you can do that, those would be the first two things any swordsman would need. Can I deflect? Deflect and bang, hit, or deflect, boom, and hit. If I got those two things, okay, you can start to go on the battlefield and hopefully defend yourself. The third is ci, thrusting. I think this is interesting that ci is third before the ge. And I think what we're doing here is going from the simple or maybe even the crude, just hit, try to aim, look to strike to the arm, to really impede your Duifang, to actively intercept them, prevent the further actions from your Duifang, but also we want to think about finishing your Duifang. Again, Duifang is an armor. So if I come in and I crack him on the shoulder, hopefully it's going to take him off balance a little bit, but not necessarily. Hopefully it stuns him, slows him down a little, but if I can, hitting him in that place again is not going to finish him. However, if I can hit that and then come in with my thrust, say to the throat, chinks in the armor, also maybe hitting the center and causing your Duifang to, right, if you really give a solid right there into the gut, cause the Duifang to bend, then, maybe I finish with another cut. So I think what we're doing here, what I would suggest the classic is telling us to do, is to go from delivering powerful cuts that really disrupt your Duifang's ability just for that moment and follow with a precision cut. So we go from something that's relatively easy to apply, something that requires more skill, more attention to detail, a focus on a target, going for the ci, the thrust. The last movement, or last type, I should say, of these 4 categories is the ge, a blocking cut. Now, ge literally means to block or obstruct. And it's understandably, I think people have misunderstood that to mean a blocking, an actual blocking edge parry sort of hard block. And there are some, if you look at some of these old manuals, this one in particular, and you say look at some European manuals for longsword, there are movements that physically look the same. But we can't just say, hey, because that manual from Europe or Germany or wherever has a movement that looks very similar to this one from Japan and this one from China and this one from wherever, that it's the same thing. I think that is really not the way to do things. We take a look, for example, at this movement. I'll just show you real quickly here. So take a look at that movement, and it's called, this is the raising the cauldron posture, and the description is raising, blocking over the head. The application can be blocking upward, attack from above. Left foot and right hand are in the level carry posture. Pull forward to hit, attacking the center, and then there's a possible follow-up, which is the stepping back skirt block. Now, when I say block here, I know that's probably giving the wrong impression because it's a ge, which is a blocking cut. Now, if we take this movement, for example, now, I'm going to take that position, and it's going to be followed up where you can pull forward to hit. So that means as you've moved back, and you're going to pull forward to hit. If we take a look at this movement, it's something like this, right? And that looks like, indeed, I'm blocking up. Literally, this movement, that phrase, the level carry is ping tai. Ping tai si. Si means a posture. Ping is level, but tai also means to lift. So what I'm really doing here is I'm lifting my blade up. So as my duifang, it's going to be using G-cuts just as I was, as my duifang is coming in to strike me, whatever strike that duifang is coming down with, what I'm looking to do, if you think of that shape of that posture, is cut up from underneath, under his arm, so that I passively intercept that cut. So as his duifang is coming down, I'm using this long blade. Some were longer than this. We also had a super long one at the beginning here. And I'm going to cut him from underneath. And I'm going to let the duifang, remember, I'm lifting here. That's what this tai means, ping tai. When I come here, I'm raising it so that it hits into the duifang's arms. So the duifang is kind of supplying the energy for himself to be cut as he cuts it down. And then my blade is there for him to bring his hands down into. Now, somebody could say, understandably, well, wait a minute, uses the word block, which means obstruct, or ge, which can literally mean to be blocking something. And hey, that does look like he's just blocking like this. I think this is the problems that we get into. We have to not just go from the image, we have to look at the material itself. We've looked at the swords and say, well, we're not seeing the damage that results from that kind of edge on edge. If that was a standard way of doing things, why do we not see the really hard, regular damage on these antique blades? And again, I'm looking at sources of several thousand, about 3,000 blades that I've handled over time. So if you're not seeing that, there's no evidence of it, you have to say that it didn't happen, or it only happened incidentally. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we don't want to just go at other sources from other cultures. They have different ways of approach. I want to go from Chinese swordsmanship. And if we look at movements that we have in forms that exist today, that are still practiced today, not ones like this that we're researching and looking at what was done in the past, we have movements, say, for example, in the Yangshu Taiji Jian, where you come like this and you go like this from underneath. Right? This is a jie movement, and it's used very specifically in this situation. Something that the manuals don't really show us is that if I'm in a thrust and I'm deflected, weapons deflected out, and I receive a downward blow, what I do is I draw back underneath, raising my blade, remember ping tai, raising my blade level to cut from underneath, right? Then I can come back with a second cut. Exactly what we see in forms today. Don't confuse this kind of jie movement, or that movement comes up like this, and my blade is here, not over here. Don't confuse that with the dai movement, the carry. So it's dai, shi, and cao, common movements that we find in Chinese swordsmanship. This is dai means to carry, it's a deflection. Jie comes up like this. So if we have a two-handed weapon, we're coming up like this, not blocking to stop the blow, not a parrying block, but a blocking cut, right? So I want to think about this. And that, of course, this kind of ge cut requires the greatest skill, best sense of distance and timing, because I have to let that dui fang come in. I have to see that weapon is coming in at me, time it, just get out from underneath it, and hit it from underneath. Same thing, this movement talks about following with the skirt block. That's exact same movement we see again like this. In later forms, if I'm receiving a cut coming to my leg, if I strike the dui fang's weapon, it doesn't really do a whole lot. And the dui fang can use that energy that I give them to come back around and strike me again. Whereas if my distance and timing are good, if I've come here and cut his hand, maybe I've missed, pulled his hand away, he comes low, and I go here, I stay close, and cut to the dui fang's arm, then I absolutely neutralize him because I've cut his arm if he hasn't got an armor. Even if he does have armor, I've certainly hurt his arm, damaged it, and moved it offline, which allows me to come back with my own G cut. Okay? So what do we got? What does the classic do for us? Because it's interesting to sort of go through it and say, oh, what's in this? Okay. What does it tell us about swordsmanship in the past? That's interesting in itself. But what we also want to do is use it to improve our practice. And so I would say what it does is it gives us a kind of a menu, if you will. Here's your 4 categories or 4 sets of tactics, 4 types of tactics for battlefield kind of swordsmanship. When we look at cuts today, there's well over 100 different names of cuts. And that's useful sometimes. You can say, here's a cut, here's this one kind of cut, quick little cut. Sometimes they're named by the direction, typically by the direction that the cut is being delivered. The length of the cut, is it a quick one? Is it a powerful cut? The situation under which you're doing it, is it a passive or active kind of position? All these kinds of little details can be, that describes this kind of cut. This one is this one is this. And that's useful if you're discussing, say, with a student, and you're saying, well, in this situation, how would you neutralize this? Oh, use such and such a cut. To have very specific, detailed kind of names is useful in describing to the student what to do, how to answer a certain situation. On the other hand, though, when we're looking at developing our tactics and our strategy, how do I deal with this general situation? It's quite useful to have just these 4 kind of categories. Okay, this situation you want to hit, this situation you want to this situation you want to neutralize with a xi, and this situation, it's a really great time to use your ge intercepting. And it's useful, I think, to have just 4 simple categories and not let ourselves get overwhelmed by, there's so many different types of cuts, what do I do? So I would suggest for your practice, what you do is you think about bouts that you've had. Next time you're in the bout and say, what tactic should I have used in that situation? And then you can get into the nitty-gritty of, well, should have used ge, blocking cut there. Well, which ge blocking cut? Which angle, which direction? But first, start from the big, get the overview, then go to the details. Okay, so that is a relatively quick view, discussion of this Shuangshou Jian Tupu, this two-handed illustrated sword manual from the Wu Bei Zhi. I hope it's useful for your practice. Hope it's interesting. Does anybody have any questions? Let me repeat real quickly for everybody. So the question is, or the observation really, is that on the cauldron block that we were talking about that I used to illustrate this idea of ge, it mentions following that up with a skirt block. And in the Chinese, I should say, it uses the term lan, which is a saber cut. And it's interesting because in later periods, ge is used in jianfa and lan is used in daofa. We also have to always keep in mind there was no standardized way of using all these terms. They vary from manual to manual. Remember, this was military secrets, you could say. in the time. So people didn't share this kind of information and say, well, we call all our cuts this. Oh, well, in this school, we call that cut this. So generally speaking, for the major cuts, like a tsu, for example, tsu is thrust. Everybody uses tsu for thrust. They're the same. But then we get cuts, well, that's called this in this system and called that in that system. Also, unfortunately, remember, these things were carved into wood to print, so they did not get into great detail. And they didn't bother to tell us, well, lan is a type of ge. And a lan cut is when you are cutting back and moving like this, at least from what we know from later manuals. Presumably that's same in the earlier period. We can't say 100%, but it's true. So lan is when you're cutting like this, like that, and moving, which we would call a ge in Jianfa. So it's simply that. So lan is a specific way, a specific type of ge. So depending on what lineage we're talking about, they may call a cut to one side by one name and a cut to another side by another name. Some will do that, some won't do that.
Yes.
So that's why it can be, I've often described these texts as being maddeningly terse. They're so terse, you do really have a lot of room for interpretation, which, then you have to go and say, well, what's the biomechanics? You have to lose a lot of sources to interpret, and not just the words literally, because it's not clear. And also a lot of times these classics use binomials that are not standard. That's not in the dictionary. You can't find those two characters together in a dictionary, even a period dictionary, and say that means this. So you have to interpret even in those cases. So, but just very simply, lan is this cutting down like this, which is, so you could say lan is a type of ge cut, right? It's a block. That's a blocking cut, right? And it makes sense in this situation, coming from the manual. If I've just come back here and I've missed, it's also you miss. Or sometimes also what happens is your blade, you're trying to come up and hit to the arm with your ge, with your edge, of course, and you hit the guard. I mean, that's why you'll find a ding sometimes up here on the blade. You smack into the guard. That's what the guard's there for. And if I do that, see, if my duifang is coming in to cut, and all of a sudden, and I try to use that line, and it hits my guard, bing, I'm moving that way with my ge cut. It's very nice for the duifang to come around this way and cut low. So a good follow-up. So this is one thing the manual, the way I would look at this manual, what's going on here, is I've come here, if this hasn't been effective, and the duifang is coming around to this side, I cut his arm like that. So if you look at it coming forward, imagine now you're looking to deliver a cut to me here. Probably I was forward in some fashion, you were deflected, you're coming here. I look to cut you from underneath, maybe hit the guard, maybe I miss, maybe you realize what I'm doing, pull your cut and swing it around the other side. And as where am I open? Here. And as you come down to take me there, I swing back. This is skirt, right? I'm coming down to the level where my skirt would be, and I cut. And this is specifically lan. But so you have to have spent a lot of time looking at a lot of material to know, oh, that's a lan, right? And unfortunately, you can find that information if you sort through a lot of things. But if you only looked at Jianfa, especially Qing period Jianfa, you're not going to find lan. That's in Daofa. So you really need to have covered a lot of material to make sure you got all that you're going to need to interpret these things. And even still, sometimes later on, you go, oh, here's something new. That's interesting. That helps me understand something. Okay, excellent. Thanks, everybody. You might want to have a look at the translations I did. It's not just this Shuangshou Jian, but a lot of other Ming period weapons, two-handed weapons. You can find that book if you just search for my name on Amazon, or just for the title, Ming Military Chinese Swordsmanship. You can find this whole manual there, other translations, lots of period illustrations. Okay, thanks everybody. Stay strong. 再见.